Welcome to the Center of Everywhere podcast, where we explore stories of rural Minnesotans who are making a difference in their communities. Rural isn't in the middle of nowhere. It is in the center of everywhere.
Hello, and welcome to Season 2, Episode 8 of the Center of Everywhere, a podcast series developed by the Center for Rural Policy and Development. I'm Kelly Asche, Research Associate for the Center. On today's episode, Marnie, Werner, and I are speaking with the Minnesota State Demographer, Susan Brower. The conversation covers how the process of redistricting maps are drawn and approved differ on paper versus the reality, how much of rural Minnesota isn't growing in population, but isn't really declining either, and ideas on how rural areas might have access to more accurate data if the census surveys turn out below standards.
And welcome to the Center of Everywhere podcast. Our guest today is Susan Brower. She's the Minnesota State Demographer. And welcome. How are you doing?
Thanks.
It's been a busy couple weeks, I suppose.
It has. Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
Yeah, thanks. So we finally got the long-awaited redistricting maps. Every 10 years, of course, we go through the census. We did that in 2020. It was a little weird, a little different, but we finally got the data. And then we finally got our redistricting maps 2 years later. I was wondering, could you talk a little bit about how the redistricting process works in Minnesota and why it's so important to do?
Sure. So in Minnesota currently, it's the responsibility of the legislature to come up with the new maps. That's what's on paper. That is not what has happened for several decades now, including this time around. What happens when the legislature is divided, for example, the Senate being Republican and the House being Democrat majorities, oftentimes they can't come to an agreement on what the map should look like. So with that kind of being in place and having been in place for the last few decades, what happens is it tends to get kicked over to the state courts. They draw maps based on the population changes, and those maps are adopted instead. This time around, because there was a delay in the release of the census numbers because of the pandemic, everything got pushed back. When we got the data, got pushed back. And so there was this compressed period of time that the legislature had to draw these maps. And some folks filed a lawsuit to kick off the process in the courts so that was happening at the same time that it was happening in the legislature. So it was a strange, I don't know in Minnesota if we have kind of what's on paper as the process ever really truly coming to fruition since the courts have decided these maps for so many decades now. But this one was particularly strange just because the courts were holding hearings and taking input and drawing their own lines at the very same time the legislature was doing so, kind of in anticipation of that kind of standstill. So
It's almost like we've fallen into a pattern that everybody agrees to. The House or the Democrats drop their maps, the Republicans drop their maps, somebody sues, and it goes to the courts.
Yes.
And so this time somebody just sued preemptively. We just said, maybe someone better sue now so we can get this process started.
That's right. And the deadline to get these out is February 15th. Of the year ending in 2. And so there really was a hard deadline. That deadline is in place so that the elections can be in place in time. And so, this is, I think I agree with you. It feels like we kind of all agree that this is what's going to happen. People tend to kind of chuckle because we all know, like, yeah, this is how it's going to go. Sorry, my phone rang there. And it went that way again this time, but in a more compressed way.
Yeah, there was none of that every 10-year discussion about should we formalize this into some kind of a panel made up of, this person and that person and judges and things. It was like, just get it to court.
That's right. But there was discussion. I'm not sure if there was discussion last time around because I wasn't as close to it, but I know that this time around there was a group of citizens who wanted, or of residents, I don't know if they were citizens or not, a group of residents in Minnesota who wanted to form an independent panel like other states have done. That didn't happen this time around. It kind of remains to be seen if that's something that will happen in the future. But for now, this is Minnesota's own kind of flavor of redistricting that we've fallen into this pattern with.
Right. And so now with we have these maps with these redistricting maps, and that's having an impact on legislators because they're anxiously looking for these maps because they want to see, am I still in the same district? Has that district moved under me, and has one of my fellow legislators ended up in the same district as me? Because this has all sorts of implications for the elections coming up, right?
That's right. I was at a conference last week speaking with legislators, and I could almost just not, it was so fresh. It was about 2 days after the maps had been released. And I really don't have any other than helping people understand the data, how to use the data, how to access it. I really don't have any other additional role in actually drawing the line. So I had to tell legislators, I know there are a lot of feelings about these maps. There are feelings. We're not going to talk about the maps today. We're just going to talk about the data. But you could tell it was really raw, just 2 days after they were released. I mean, they've spent time building relationships with people in their district. And so I'm sure it feels very much like the rug is pulled out from under you when you have a part of your district lopped up, the people that you've come to know, the meetings you've gone to, that's gone. And you can, in some cases, welcome new areas, but I know it is a big change for folks, and especially if they're put in a district with another incumbent.
Yeah, and if I remember correctly, that's more likely to happen in greater Minnesota because the districts often have to get larger because the population centers are growing faster. And so the districts there will shrink to get them down to the target population. And the districts elsewhere have to get larger to get them up to the target population. And so in populated areas, you're more likely to end up with new empty districts. Does that sound right?
I think so. I haven't looked enough to look at where, I looked up and saw that there were, 7 pairs of incumbents in the Senate put together, 12 pairs of incumbents in the House put together, but I didn't look at how they were distributed across the state, but just the mechanics of it would make sense to me. That you would see that more in larger districts, less populated districts, except for the fact that even if you have a district in a metro area that doesn't need to change or needs, excuse me, or even needs to shrink, it may have to change just because its neighbors need to change. So no district is safe, even if it's exactly the right number of people. Yeah.
That was just released. I believe it was I'm forgetting their name, Marnie. Is it Carsey?
Oh, Carsey Institute in New Hampshire?
Yeah, the Carsey Institute. And they had an article that said rural America declined in population for the first time in, I think it was history, right? Which is interesting, right? Because we always talk about rural America losing population, but actually this was the first census where it actually happened. I'm curious, in rural Minnesota, or I should say in Minnesota in general, what did you see with the new census numbers coming out? Like, did all of greater Minnesota lose population? I kind of know the answer to that, but I'd be curious from your perspective, where do the population shifts and where are they happening, particularly in greater Minnesota?
Yeah. So if we're thinking about the area that we often call Greater Minnesota, which is the 80 counties outside of the 7-county metro, where we saw growth in that area was mostly in the metropolitan areas of the state. So the Mankato area, the Rochester area, not the rural areas per se, but the metros in Greater Minnesota really did see strong growth, except for Duluth. Duluth was the one metro that really, it stayed about the same. It was really pretty stable. And then we also saw growth in some of our larger towns, our larger cities in Greater Minnesota. So not just the huge metros, the Mankato's, the Moorheads, some of our larger cities grew in Greater Minnesota as well. Where we continued to see population declines were really in the truly more remote areas in the townships of our state. And that's a pattern that's been going on for a very long time. But what I will say is when I talk to folks about growth and decline, I think what they have in their head for the most part is there's this great emptying out of some of these rural areas, this great hollowing out. And it's much more like a trickle. It's not, I think people have this sense that there's this tremendous growth in metro areas and this tremendous emptying out in rurals. It's much more a picture of stability for the most part, with a little bit of losses in these truly rural areas. And then the growth is just big and punctuated in those metro areas in contrast to that stability and that very small decline. So that's, I keep seeing articles saying, the decline, and really, yes, that happens in some of our areas. In fact, I have a map I'll share with you, and if you want to stick it somewhere where your listeners you can see specifically where those losses happen. And they did happen in very small numbers in the most rural areas of our state, in the Southwest, kind of agriculture areas in the northern part of the state, that's very sparsely populated, but it's not kind of an exodus like people often have in their minds. That's not really the picture that we're talking about.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I think that's one way we've kind of tried to frame it up too, is that, even with the redistricting numbers, it really isn't about this uber loss of population. It's rather about where the substantial growth in population. So kind of everybody's pretty much staying the same, except for these few spots that are really seeing a growth. And correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like even in the Central Lakes region of Minnesota, you see some population growth, not huge, but even their districts had to get a little bigger despite the fact that they had population growth, because they're just not growing as fast, right?
That's right. And so much of the redistricting isn't about population losses. It's about accommodating that big growth, because we have the same number of seats each decade. And so you have to accommodate where that great big growth area was, or areas were.
Yeah, right. And I always kind of imagine it too, if you go to a national scale, Minnesota itself isn't a fast growing state. Like, we're kind of a slow growth state, right? So even when we talk, go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, so I'd say we're just a hair above the national average, but that includes all these really fast growing states. And then some states a few states lost population this decade. And the rural states that don't have major metropolitan areas, grow much slower than we do. So I'd say we're kind of average to the slow side of things, just because of where we're located in the US.
Right. And so even the redistricting within the state kind of mirrors the number of US House representatives that each state is given, where Minnesota grew in population, but we almost lost a House member because we didn't grow fast enough compared to Arizona and some of these other states, right? So
yeah, that's right. Absolutely.
Well, so we have had discussions, I know, Susan, about kind of some of the issues surrounding the most recent decennial census. And I know the U.S. Census Bureau always works so hard on this stuff. And I continue to rely on their numbers, and they do great work. But I know this particular census had its kind of intricacies, or I should say nuances around it, its challenges. And before we get into I know the bigger topic, which is differential privacy, I did want to talk about, while the census was being implemented, there were these issues. We had the pandemic. We kind of had what I would call political shenanigans surrounding the census about who we're counting and not counting. And the U.S. Census Bureau overall had budget shortfalls, right? They were not super well funded for this round of decennial census. And so this raised all those questions. And I know a lot of data folks, policy analysts, people like us, we're a little bit nervous going into this. I'd be curious, I know you sit on kind of a committee that overlooks the decennial census and gives feedback and input. How have some of those issues outside of differential privacy, how have those worked out? Have you seen anything concerning, or has everything worked out okay?
I would say that we don't know yet. We know that for some of the things that we do know, I can speak to those, and then I can talk about what we don't know yet. We know that Minnesotans responded to the census in an amazing fashion. We are first in the nation for self-response rate. I will not ever miss an opportunity to bring that up.
Sorry to interrupt. What was our percentage? It was 70 something, right?
Yeah, 75.1, I think was the percentage, and 67%. Yeah. So quite a bit above the national average. We're always above the national average, or we historically have been, but we really expected our response rate to go down this time around, and it went up. And so that was a fantastic surprise. There were all kinds of people involved in, efforts to get the word out. So I would say we know from past censuses and past surveys, when people fill out the form themselves, we get better data than when we have to rely on census takers to go out. And maybe they find the people at home, maybe they don't. If they aren't able to reach a household member, they rely on what a neighbor has to say. They rely on a mail carrier, on a guy on the street. I don't know. They rely on somebody who may know something. And those kinds of answers may end up being, yeah, I think 2 people live there. Maybe there's one now. I'm not sure. Just put 2 down, So you can see that when people answer themselves, we get much better data. So I'll say that our response rate bodes very well for having better data. That high response rate was much, much higher in some areas and much lower in other areas. So I won't say across the board we saw very high response rates, but for many parts of the state, we saw the response rate go up over the decade. And what we don't know yet, the Census Bureau does some surveying afterwards to try to get a better read of who was missed. And that's what we don't have back yet. And it's supposed to come out, at least for the nation, I think in the next couple of weeks, to see, are there groups that were undercounted? I'm sure there will be, but we'll get a better sense of just how much people were undercounted in the census. And then the only other area of concern I would point out is that, especially in some college areas like around Winona, we saw quite a bit of losses where we have college populations. So that remains a concern for me, especially in greater Minnesota campuses. A little bit less, at least it's a little bit harder to read in the more metro areas, or in the Twin Cities in particular, but some of those state colleges campuses that have college populations that live off campus, those are areas of concern, just from looking at changes that we wouldn't expect to see.
What about, I know there was some conversation too, just about the number of, I think it was housing units. I know you had a conversation with Ben Winchester about that, and some of the kind of, looking at the 2010 data to the 2020 data, there was quite a significant change in housing units. And that has a lot to do with the way they kind of gather their information on how they're going to essentially send the survey out. Has there been any update on that side of things?
No, that's still an outstanding question too. So the question is, was there really that big of a decline in the number of housing units in greater Minnesota between 2010 and 2020? Or did that decline happen more gradually beginning sooner than 2010 and we just didn't capture it till 2020? Or did it not happen at all and it's erroneous? So that is still a question that's out there, whether that initial, that foundational count of where people could potentially live is accurate. And as Ben pointed out, he thought he saw areas that declined faster than people would have expected in some areas. So the question is that real? Is it a measurement issue, or is it a real concern, which it sure could be.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I know the next topic for us kind of data nerds, we kind of get huffy puffy about is the differential privacy thing. And I kind of want to set this question up with an article I read. I think it was Bloomberg City Lab. I don't know if you guys read that. They always do a nice job. They have a lot of kind of data stuff. And they were talking a little bit about the decennial census and some of the accuracy issues that might be popping up, in particular on differential privacy. But they really set it up in this interesting way where they talked about, if everybody's familiar with Liberty Island, New York City, right, where the Statue of Liberty is. There's 2 people that live there.
Oh, okay.
So in 2010, it had 2 people, but it used to be, as you know, the census has always added a little bit of noise to the data for data privacy. I think they called it exchanging or swapping, right?
Yep.
So it was 2 people, and then their race and ethnicity they had listed as Asian, but they were actually white. And so that was a swapping. They got the population right, but they swapped out the ethnicity and race in order to kind of fool people who those 2 people were, right?
Yeah.
So now with the most recent 2020 data, between 2010 and 2020, a storm actually wiped out their house. So there's no one inhabiting Statue Island or Liberty Island anymore. But the 2020 census says there's 42 people living there.
Oh my goodness. They're camping.
So, and it has to do with this differential privacy adding noise into the data. It was actually research done by the University of Minnesota. I believe the Population Center kind of dug into it, and they're like, okay, well, something's going on here. So that kind of gives you like an introduction of, to folks listening, differential privacy puts this noise, particularly into places where it could be really easy to attach identity to the data that you could see in a table presented by the 2020 decennial census. So in this case, it went from 0 people, which is reality, to like 42 people, which was just the noise added. How have you seen that conversation playing out? I know the Census Bureau has gone through multiple iterations of differential privacy, trying to get it right. So both adding noise while also not hurting so much on the accuracy side of things. Any updates on that end?
So the data got much better before the release and up through the release of the redistricting file. And that's everything that we have so far is just the redistricting file. And so through these many iterations, these many stabs at producing files that would work well for folks, absolutely, we saw improvements in accuracy over that time period. What we got still is not what people expected, and we have been fielding, phone calls and having conversations with folks for the last several months, particularly mayors in greater Minnesota of small cities who say, my data is wrong, how do I fix it? Which is a perfectly reasonable thing to say when you know the count, or in the case of most of the problems that folks were having with the data, it wasn't as much that they were worried about the total population, but the occupancy rate. So they were just getting some wacky occupancy rates. For example, mayors would call and say, I know my occupancy rate is 96%. They would know because they know the households, they know, who's living where, and when something's empty, they know this stuff. Just, they don't need to look at the data table to know it. They'd get the census data back and it would say, 50%. And they would be really worried about, with good reason, about, will this be used for any kind of funding, will this have repercussions in the future? And so that's kind of what we are still working through with local officials, and also, with the Census Bureau. That's feedback that we've given the Census Bureau that says, yeah, it works pretty well for larger cities, but we have thousands of small towns and small cities in Minnesota, literally thousands, for which they don't have the one time a year very, very accurate data. So it is an ongoing issue. It's something that we really have pushed back pretty hard with the Census Bureau about, because of our concern for the accuracy and just knowing how these data are used by folks. We know that it's really important. For the data that will be released coming up, they're still working out what that's going to look like. We are about to see kind of their first set of demonstrator, or one person in my office is on a team that will see, it's very secretive, but we'll see a first iteration of these data. So that's coming, but it will be impacting, the age data that we get, the race data that we get, all the things that we kind of use as baselines for the next 10 years. So it's the nerdiest thing that raises my blood pressure, I think. If there's anything nerdy that does it, it's that.
I completely understand. After years of me putting trend lines together,
yeah,
I'm just like, can I add this now to a trend line? That scares me. Like, I don't know.
Yeah.
How do you make a case for, everything from writing grants to economic development to attracting businesses when the data you have now doesn't fit with the data you had previously?
Yeah, I mean, I think it just, I'm hoping we will still see a turnaround, that we will see better data coming out of this next round of releases. But if we don't, if this is truly the course that the Census Bureau will take, I think it's just going to take a lot of education, because people have in their minds that the census data are the gold standard. That's what we look to. That's what we rely on. It's sad, but I think it takes some more education for grant makers and for people who are submitting their grants, who are using these data, to understand that there's just a lot more fuzziness, less precision than we're used to having, and that we have to make our decisions accordingly with the absence of that precision.
One thing I've heard some people throw around is the idea of, in the context of small communities applying for grants for programs. I'm thinking USDA rural development, right? Even our initiative foundations, lots of philanthropy organizations in the state, a lot of them are looking for and expecting more data around equity and race and ethnicity type questions, right? I'm curious, your opinion on the potential of the state or somebody offering grants to communities to do their own survey work when needed. Is that something that's realistic, or is that something that's just, it's just so difficult and challenging that might be impossible?
I don't know. I haven't thought about that as a solution. It sure may be, but I just wonder if there are other administrative data that could be pooled, if that would make more sense. To come up with estimates that aren't wholly based on the decennial census. Our office, for example, puts out population estimates each year. If we were to produce something based on administrative records or based on blended years of other surveys, I could imagine kind of going that route. I'm just thinking, if we were to provide, or we being the state, not me, we, if the state were to provide funds for people to do their own survey work, it seems like there would be so much of a learning curve for each person to have to figure out how to do that. So I guess I've thought more about what alternative or supportive data products could we put out there that would help fill out the picture.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. I'm doing a project with SLED's data that also mixes in some deed data.
Yeah.
And, I tell some of my friends, like, how's the information? And that they have access to, it's kind of scary.
Yeah.
Like, I don't mean that in like, our government's tracking us, but I mean, there is a lot of information that can be pulled together to kind of figure out where everybody's at. And even the all payers database and the healthcare, Minnesota Department of Health. Oh man, that could be a great potential for tracking numbers and things like that. But
yeah, totally. Yeah, I think we haven't had to turn to those kinds of data sources as kind of people working in policy as much and in the public realm, because we've had the census data, but corporations have been using it for years. So it's the capability to have that data outside of the federal government is out there. It's just a matter of how we jointly access it and how we use it and so forth. Yeah.
Well, I tell you what, Susan, if the state demographer's office ever gets to a point where you want to advocate to get access or have more resources, let us know. We will be on the front lines for you guys to get that information. So we would happy to make the case of why it's important for rural Minnesota.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think we're absolutely getting there. It's the question is, if we're coming up to this point where we have all these data that we've had in the past, and we haven't even talked about the American Community Survey yet, but the same thing holds true for that, that if what we're seeing because of concerns about privacy is a degradation of the data that we used to have access to, I think we're going to have to we're not going to just go without. We're going to have to figure out what else can we use that works for us.
Yeah, I appreciate hearing that, because I think a lot of us on the data side are like, man, is this it? Is this the end of the golden era of data access to things? So I'm happy to hear that.
It seems like it should just keep going up, right? That's what we've been hearing. We've just been hearing like more and more data keeps coming online. We have more access. We have more computing power. We have more everything. And now, in part because of that, I mean, that's part of the reason why differential privacy was introduced, these protections that the Census Bureau is putting in. And we're all for these protections. They were put in place in part because they were worried that people could re-identify someone, not based on the census alone, but by combining it with other data sources that are out there. So that's kind of, this prompted this to begin with. I may be going too far down the nerdy hole, but that was what prompted this to begin with. And so we're all for privacy. We get in rural areas, especially where there's fewer people, easier to identify folks. But the concern is just that it's that we've lost too much and very valuable stuff for this potential threat. So.
Well, Susan, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate you talking to you today. It's always great. When should we have you back to get an update? Maybe towards the end of the year and we'll know more?
I'm happy to come anytime. Yeah. I think, I'm not sure when the next release will be out, but we'll hear more about the quality of the data coming up pretty quick here, I think.
All right.
You've been listening to the Center of Everywhere podcast, where we explore stories of rural Minnesotans who are making a difference in their communities. Rural isn't in the middle of nowhere. It is in the center of everywhere.